Peter Williams moved like a shadow through the kennels that night. His skin sticky with hog's blood, whispering words the dogs had long since learned to obey. Their howls cut through the plantation air, a sound that would soon flip fear on its head. For years, Elias Ford, the overseer, whose name was spoken like a curse across 3 counties, had used those hounds to hunt men into submission. But before dawn broke, Ford would learn what it meant when prey finally turned predator. By morning, there would be panic screams and a path north carved in silence, one no dog would ever dare follow again. That fall of 1850 carried a strange chill over Whitmore Plantation in southern Georgia, where endless rows of cotton glowed white against the sun. Among the enslaved, Peter stood apart not because of his strength, though he was tall and broad, but because of the quiet sharpness in his eyes. At 28, he had known nothing but this land, yet he carried within him a gift few understood. From childhood, Peter could soothe wild horses with a touch guide, strays back with a whisper, and turn away rattlesnakes with calm presence alone. To some, it was a kind of ancient magic. To him, it was simple animals spoke, and he listened. Elias Ford had arrived 3 years earlier, a wiry man with pale, cold eyes and a history that bled from state to state, South Carolina, Louisiana, leaving broken spirits and shallow graves behind. Whitmore had hired him for discipline, and Ford delivered with cruelty that made the whip seem merciful. But what made him truly feared were the dogs. 6 hulking bloodhounds trained not just to track, but to tear. They knew the scent of fear and chased it like a command. The sound of their baying could break a man's will before teeth ever touched flesh. Peter had seen it himself. 17-year-old Moses had run one summer morning desperate to reach his sister. He barely made 5 miles before the hounds brought him down. When they dragged him back, the boy was half dead. His body shredded, his eyes hollow, his limp permanent. That sight burned into Peter's mind. Slowly, quietly, he began to watch the dogs. He studied their movements, their hunger for attention, the way they softened under kindness. Ford saw weapons. Peter saw creatures that could be taught. Every morning, the overseer strutted past the pen, his prized beasts pressing against the fence for his approval. But Peter had begun slipping in at night, speaking in tones only the hounds understood, building a language in the shadows. A language that one night soon would turn Ford's greatest weapon into his greatest undoing. Peter's position in the smokehouse gave him the kind of freedom few enslaved men ever had. The building sat only 50 yards from Ford's quarters, and his duty to tend the curing fires at odd hours allowed him to move under cover of darkness when most of the plantation slept. It was in these stolen moments that Peter began his quiet campaign to win the loyalty of Ford's most feared instruments of terror. He started with observation, watching the dogs from a distance as they paced behind the iron fencing. Rex, the scarred and battle-worn alpha, commanded the pack's respect, while the smaller females lingered at the edges, wary but curious. Peter saw what Ford could not, or refused to see, that beneath the growl and bite the hounds longed for affection they were never given. Ford had trained them through fear, treating them as nothing more than living weapons. Peter offered something entirely different. One moonless September night, he approached the pen carrying scraps of fresh pork from the smokehouse. The dogs bristled and bared their teeth, but Peter's steady voice and unhurried movements carried the rhythm of trust. He crouched low, extended the meat through the bars, and waited. 2 of the younger females broke, first edging forward to sniff, then daring to accept both the food and the gentle scratch behind their ears. It was a fragile beginning, but enough to spark hope. Night after night, Peter returned, never rushing, always patient. Soon the pack no longer greeted him with suspicion, but with quiet whines and eager tales that he carefully hushed so as not to alert Ford. Rex was the hardest to win. The old hound's loyalty to Ford had been hammered in by years of brutal training. Yet even Rex could not resist the steady kindness Peter offered Meat's soft words and respect, given not out of dominance but understanding. The day came when Rex finally pressed his massive head against the bars, accepting Peter's touch. That moment confirmed what Peter had known all along: the dogs weren't truly Ford's. They could belong to someone who saw them as more than tools. With trust earned, Peter advanced to the second phase of his plan. He mimicked Ford's commands but shifted the tones ever so slightly, adding new hand signals, teaching the hounds to respond to him as readily as they did their overseer. It was delicate work. He could not undo Ford's conditioning without raising suspicion, so he layered his own system on top of it. By November, the hounds no longer feared him. They obeyed. While training in secret, Peter studied Ford with equal precision. He charted his habits, the times he left his quarters, when he slept, how often he drank, where he carried his pistol, and how he relied on the presence of his hounds as both shield and threat. That arrogance, the certainty that no one would dare rise against him, would be Ford's undoing. The breaking point came one bitter morning. Sarah, a young woman desperate to reach her children, sold to another plantation, had been caught trying to send them a letter. Ford seized on her act as an opportunity to remind every soul who truly owned them. He ordered the slaves gathered in the yard, tied Sarah to a post, and prepared his dogs for a spectacle of punishment. Peter stood among the crowd, his fists clenched, his heart burning. He had spent months turning fear into loyalty, teaching the hounds that his voice mattered. And now, as Ford barked orders and the pack strained at their chains, Peter knew the time he had waited for had finally arrived. Peter moved like a shadow up the porch steps, the pig blood clinging to his clothes and skin, the pack close and silent behind him, because they trusted him now more than the man who had trained them with fear. Ford slept with a lantern guttering on the table and his pistol within reach. But the overseer had never imagined his weapons could be turned on him. So he slept heavy and sure, and that confidence was all Peter needed. He set the dogs in place with a single low command they had learned from him alone. Then edged the porch door open and stepped inside. The dogs a quiet pressure at his back, and when Ford stirred and reached for the pistol, Peter spoke again, calm and iron, and the hounds moved with the precision of hunters, finally given a purpose that was not cruelty, but balance. Two of them lunged to pin Ford as he scrambled. Another knocked the pistol from his hand, and Rex, the scarred alpha, held the overseer down with a strength that crushed his flailing. Ford screamed and cursed and tried to bargain. But the pack trained to obey Peter and not to maim what was not part of the design bit, and held until the man who had used fear as a tool could not rise to use it anymore. Then Peter stepped forward, not to watch vengeance become spectacle, but to end the threat. He made sure the pistol was tucked away, that Ford could not rally the plantation with one last shot. And when it was done, he closed the door behind him and walked out into the night, leading the dogs away from the quarters, not toward celebration, but toward the deep woods to the north, where the ground was wet and the scent lines blurred. He left no obvious trail back, only the noise of a scuffle, and the tenant rumor that would swell into legend back in the yard. The gathered people heard the distant baying stop, and then nothing later they would speak of screams and chaos, of Ford found where he fell, of Sarah trembling but alive, and of a line of footprints heading north that no hunting hound ever followed again. Peter vanished into that cold November dawn with the dogs at his side, not as a victorious avenger shouting his triumph, but as a quiet shadow who had shifted the balance and taken with him the knowledge that sometimes those who have been hunted learn how to lead. Peter crouched beneath the open window heart, hammering as the final act of his plan unfolded. With subtle hand signals and a low whisper, he directed the dog's attention toward the man sleeping inside. The stench of pig's blood that coated him carried the layered message he had built into them over months, he was the alpha, and the hunt was sanctioned. Ford, once their master, was now nothing more than prey. When Peter gave the signal, a whistle so soft it barely cut the night, the pack exploded into motion. 6 bloodhounds surged through the open door, and windows, a blur of teeth and muscle descending on Ford, with the same ruthless precision they had once reserved for runaways. The overseer's screams ripped through the darkness, raw and panicked, as his own instruments of terror turned against him. Peter did not rush inside. He stood in the shadows listening, letting the symmetry of the moment sink in. The man who had broken so many spirits with cruelty and fear now choked on the taste of it himself. The attack was efficient, brutal, and final. Then silence. Only the sound of heavy breathing and claws shifting on wooden floors remained. Time was short. Within minutes, someone would notice. Peter whistled again, and the pack returned to him willingly, their muzzles slicked their eyes, waiting for guidance. In that instant, he faced a choice. He could lock them back in their pen, restore the cycle of captivity, or he could free them the way he hoped one day to free himself. Without hesitation, he led them past the fence line and into the deep woods beyond the plantation. At the tree line, the hounds lingered, watching him, understanding. Then, one by one, they melted into the night, finally wild, finally free. Peter turned back alone, but not without purpose. He scattered torn bits of Ford's clothing, streaks of blood, and personal effects along a false trail running north, a breadcrumb path suggesting that Ford had been dragged off by unknown attackers fleeing toward free soil. By dawn, the plantation would find their overseer dead, a mystery clouding his fate, and a trail no hound would ever follow. For the enslaved who had lived under Ford's reign, whispers of that night would carry hope, proof that even the most feared predator could fall when one man dared to rewrite the rules. By the time dawn broke, Peter had erased every trace of his role in the overseer's death. He buried the jars that once held pig's blood, burned the stained clothes he had worn, and scrubbed himself clean in a cold stream until no hint of the night's work remained. What was left behind told a story he had carefully crafted, a story that pointed suspicion anywhere but at him. When Master Whitmore returned from Savannah 2 days later, his plantation was in disarray. Ford's body had been discovered by fellow overseers, and the false trail Peter created led north, whispering of abolitionists or escaped slaves striking back. The sheriff's men questioned everyone, even Peter, but found nothing. His quiet manner and reputation for obedience shielded him, and his convincingly solemn grief over Ford's death left no one doubting his innocence. The disappearance of Ford's prized bloodhounds only deepened the mystery. Authorities assumed they had been stolen, and newspapers fanned the flames of fear by blaming abolitionist plots and outside agitators. To the enslaved, however, their absence meant something far greater: the end of the overseer's reign of terror. Within a week, Whitmore installed a new overseer, Roberts. He enforced order, but without Ford's brutality or his terrifying dogs. The change was immediate. The yard no longer rang with the threat of baying hounds, and the people on the plantation began to move differently. Shoulders straightened, voices carried a little louder, and hope fragile as it was threaded itself back into daily life. Peter kept his silence. He returned to his smokehouse duties, his face unreadable, his secret safe. He told no one, not even those he trusted most, what had truly happened. But he watched the difference unfold around him. Sarah no longer flinched at shadows, the children played without constant fear, and men and women alike found courage in small acts of defiance they would never have risked before. The truest proof of his victory came months later when Roberts tried to buy new hunting dogs. Traders brought them in, trained and vicious, but on Whitmore land, they faltered. They refused to track, refused to bite, as if some invisible boundary turned them docile. Stories spread that Ford's ghost and his hounds haunted the grounds, warning off replacements. But Peter knew better. By setting the pack free, he had altered something beyond human reckoning, a message carried in instinct passed from one creature to another, that this place no longer belonged to predators. Peter never spoke of it, but within him lived the knowledge of what he had done. Not just the fall of one overseer, but a quiet shift in power that rippled across the plantation. A secret victory written in silence, blood, and freedom. As the frost of winter melted into spring, Peter found himself staring into an uncertain future. Ford's death had been more than revenge. It was a revelation. He had proven that even within the iron cage of slavery, one man's will and cunning could bend the world in ways that once seemed impossible. But that victory left him restless. The overseer was gone, yet the system that had empowered him remained. The question became, what next? The answer arrived unexpectedly. One moonlit night, when Peter stumbled across a group of weary travelers taking refuge in the derelict sheds at the far edge of Whitmore Plantation. They were escapees fleeing north under the guidance of a tall, sharp-eyed woman who called herself Freedom. She had claimed the name as her own after breaking chains on a Louisiana sugar plantation. One look at Peter, and she seemed to recognize in him a kindred spirit, a man who carried both scars and secrets, someone who had already fought back against the machinery of bondage. Freedom's group was part of the Underground Railroad, a living network of secret routes and safe houses stretching northward toward hope. They were always searching for local allies, people who could move quietly, supply food, share knowledge of back roads and dangers, or simply keep watch. Peter's smokehouse duties gave him an unusual kind of liberty. His late-night movements raised no suspicion. More importantly, his proven ability to plan and execute without detection made him invaluable. When they invited him into their hidden world, it felt less like a choice and more like destiny. Peter's first mission was a family of 4 from a neighboring plantation, desperate to flee an overseer whose cruelty rivaled Ford's. Using the same meticulous care that had brought down the bloodhound master, Peter mapped out their escape. He drew on his deep knowledge of the land where the rivers ran low, when the weather turned, which woods offered the best cover. He slipped them, food left water at hidden drops, and guided them northward through coded signs and whispered directions. They made it. That success became his foundation. Word spread along the hidden pathways. Conductors across Georgia and even South Carolina began routing escapees toward Peter's quiet corner of Whitmore land. Each operation carried risk, but Peter layered his work in secrecy. He never met fugitives directly, if it could be avoided, relying instead on dead drops, hidden caches, and subtle signals that kept the network compartmentalized. If one link broke, the rest held. Slave catchers and deputies prowled the countryside, sniffing for signs of rebellion. But Peter remained a step ahead, his methods as precise as ever. By summer 1851, whispers of possibility had rippled through the enslaved communities of central Georgia. Even those who could not run felt the shift. People carried themselves with new posture, spoke with quieter but bolder defiance, and began to imagine futures beyond the fields. For the first time in living memory, fear loosened its grip. Master Whitmore saw it too. Productivity still held, but there was something different in his people's eyes. Something unsettling. He blamed the absence of Ford and resolved to clamp down again, planning to bring in fresh guards and harsher discipline. Peter knew then that his window was closing. He had lit a flame in the darkness, but the masters would soon gather to smother it. The challenge before him was no longer simply to strike at a single oppressor. It was to keep the flame alive, to fan it across the South in ways the overseers could not stamp out. The war within him was far from finished. In truth, it had only just begun. Peter's decision to finally seek freedom for himself was born not out of fear, but inevitability. The Underground Railroad he had nurtured was thriving, but its success carried a heavy cost. Slaveholders tightened their grip, punishing the many for the bravery of the few. When Peter learned that Whitmore intended to sell off part of his labor force to cover debts from failed cotton speculation, and that his own name was on the list, he understood the choice had been made for him. He would not be passed like property into the hands of another master. If he was to leave, it would be on his own terms. This escape was unlike any he had planned for others. Peter's face, his name, and his quiet authority were well known to overseers and sheriffs across the county. He could not rely on anonymity, and he could not afford to risk exposing the network he had built. So he severed every connection, erased every trace of his involvement, and set about crafting an exit as carefully as he had ever plotted an operation. Food and tools were hidden at discreet intervals, false trails prepared to mislead trackers, and routes mapped with precision down to weather patterns and natural cover. The storm that finally broke over Georgia was as if summoned by fate, violent, relentless. The sky split with lightning, and the ground churned to mud. While others huddled in their cabins, Peter slipped into the tempest, his movements masked by the roar of wind and rain. The downpour obliterated his footprints, drowned the sounds of his departure, and challenged even the best bloodhounds to follow his scent. Where others would have faltered, Peter pressed on with the calm certainty of a man who knew the land like the lines of his own palm. By dawn, soaked and exhausted, he reached the first safe house, the farm of Joshua, a free black man, long allied with the railroad. Joshua greeted him, not as a desperate fugitive, but as a respected comrade offering dry clothes, hot food, and intelligence about the roads ahead. Word of Peter's deeds had traveled farther than he realized. Each safe house he reached along the chain treated him with a kind of reverence, not as a man begging passage, but as one who had already earned his place in the story of freedom. Back at Whitmore plantation chaos reigned when Roberts discovered Peter's absence. A search of his quarters revealed nothing left behind. No loose threads, no overlooked possession, just the clear signature of a man who never intended to return. Search parties swept the countryside, dogs bayed uselessly at muddied trails, and slave catchers scoured every likely path. All admitted the same bitter truth. Whoever this man was, he had studied their methods and dismantled them piece by piece. The trail went cold, and Peter vanished into myth. Among the enslaved, Peter's escape spread like fire. His reputation as the quiet, compliant worker made his disappearance even more powerful. If he could break free, then perhaps anyone could. For Whitmore and neighboring planters, his absence was a reminder that control was never absolute. For the people still in chains, it was proof that knowledge, patience, and determination could unmake the system one step at a time. The network Peter helped build carried on, without him more careful now, but no less determined. His presence lingered in whispers, in the routes he mapped, in the courage he awakened. Though his body moved northward into freedom, his spirit remained in Georgia, a living example that resistance was not only possible, but contagious. Peter's story did not end with his escape. It expanded into a living legacy that shaped the fight for freedom long after his footsteps faded from Georgia soil. The operators he had trained carried forward the work with precision and courage, guiding dozens more to liberty in the months and years that followed. His influence was no longer just a matter of one man's defiance. It became a shared knowledge, a set of strategies and principles that spread across the Underground Railroad like sparks carried on the wind. His own journey to freedom carried him steadily northward through Virginia, Maryland, and Pennsylvania. Each stage brought him into contact with people who already knew his name. Word of the man who had turned an overseer's own hounds against him had traveled quickly through the abolitionist network. To them, Peter was more than an escapee. He was living proof that intelligence and resolve could dismantle even the fiercest chains. Many treated him with honor, eager to provide shelter, food, and guidance to someone who had risked everything, not just for himself, but for countless others. At last, Peter crossed into Canada, beyond the reach of American law and the slave catchers who once hunted him. He settled in a small town near Toronto, working as a blacksmith. The skills he had honed in secrecy, discipline, patience, resourcefulness now helped him forge an honest living as a free man. But he did not simply fade into obscurity. Peter continued his fight in new ways, advising abolitionist groups, offering comfort and direction to newly arrived escapees, and speaking publicly when his testimony could give weight to the movement. His words carried the authority of lived experience, inspiring both those still enslaved and those committed to ending the institution. Back in Georgia, the shadows of his actions lingered. The dogs he had freed roamed the wilderness, occasionally spotted by hunters who spoke of a strange, intelligent pack that seemed to outwit traps and vanish before gunfire could find them. Stories of these creatures grew into folklore, with whispers that they carried a supernatural aura, once instruments of terror, now as spirits of freedom haunting the woods. Whitmore never replaced Ford's bloodhounds. The psychological advantage they had once provided was gone. Everyone now knew they could be turned that even the fiercest weapon might obey another master. Planters turned to more expensive and less effective forms of control, but the spell of absolute dominance had been broken. The knowledge that escape was possible, that resistance could succeed, seeped into the bones of enslaved communities across central Georgia. People stood taller, spoke with new conviction, and looked northward with hope. The system still ground on brutal and unyielding, but it no longer felt untouchable. Peter's story became a parable of patience, intelligence, and strategy. He had proven that oppression carried its own hidden weaknesses, flaws that could be exploited by those willing to see them. From his training of Ford's dogs to his careful misdirections on the night of his escape, Peter's methods became part of the Underground Railroad's shared wisdom. Operators passed them along, embedding his legacy not just in memory, but in practice. Though he lived the rest of his life in freedom, far from the fields of Georgia, the ripples of his defiance carried on. His name became a whisper of hope among the enslaved, a rallying cry for abolitionists, and a reminder that even in the darkest of times, one man's courage could shake an empire built on fear. As the years slipped by in Canada, Peter Williams grew into the role of elder, surrounded by children and grandchildren who would never know the lash or the overseer's whistle. In the quiet hours of his life, his thoughts often returned to that singular night in Georgia, the night he had drenched himself in pig's blood, whispered to Ford's hounds, and turned the tools of terror back upon their master. That moment had been the fulcrum of his destiny. It was the night a quiet slave, known only for his gift with animals, discovered his true power lay not in bending beasts to his will, but in outthinking men who believed themselves untouchable. The hounds never returned to the work of tracking flesh and fear. Instead, they vanished into the woods, their freedom echoing Peter's own. That blood-soaked night became legend, a spark in the long struggle that would swell into civil war. To Peter, it was not just vengeance or even escape. It was proof that resistance was possible, that oppression always carried within it the seeds of its undoing. His life stood as testimony. With intelligence, patience, and courage, even the most powerless could strike a blow that echoed far beyond themselves. In Canada, Peter found not just refuge, but purpose. He settled in the town of Chatham, a thriving community of escaped slaves, freedmen and freeborn blacks. Farmers, teachers, craftsmen, and dreamers mingled there, building lives from the ashes of bondage. Peter's blacksmith shop quickly became more than a business. It was a hub, a place where iron rang against anvils by day and plans whispered in the shadows by night. He brought with him the same discipline and security he had practiced in Georgia. Meetings happened under the cover of commerce messages passed as casually as tools across a counter. To outsiders, it was nothing more than a tradesman's shop. To those in the know, it was a sanctuary and a nerve center for resistance. It was there that Marcus arrived, a young man from Virginia, his eyes blazing with the same rage Peter had once carried. Marcus had fled after seeing his sister sold south, swallowed into the brutal maw of the Deep South's markets. His fury burned hot, unshaped, and dangerous. Peter recognized himself in the young man's anger, remembered the nights when his own hatred threatened to consume him. Instead of letting Marcus charge headlong into destruction, Peter steadied him. He taught him patience, strategy, and the art of making vengeance serve a larger purpose. Peter's greatest triumph was not in the single act of turning Ford's dogs against him, nor even in reaching freedom. It was in what he built after, in shaping the next generation of fighters, in transforming rage into organized defiance, in proving that ordinary men and women could rewrite the rules imposed on them. His blacksmith's fire forged not just tools and horseshoes, but the will and strategy of a movement. And while his hair turned gray and his back bent with years, the fire that had lit within him that November night in Georgia never dimmed. Under Peter's steady hand, Marcus evolved from a young man ruled by rage into a strategist shaped by discipline. What began as lessons in concealment and coded communication grew into something deeper, an education in how systems of oppression sustained themselves, and how they could be dismantled piece by piece. Peter emphasized that true resistance was not a single strike against a master, but the construction of networks and institutions strong enough to endure long after one man's defiance. Their bond became like that of father and son, forged in trust, shared purpose, and the long shadow of slavery. Marcus absorbed every detail, eventually rising to become one of Peter's most capable partners in the Underground Railroad. Together they coordinated routes that stretched from Ontario back into the Carolinas and Virginia, ensuring that the line of freedom remained open despite growing dangers. Through Marcus's southern contacts, Peter learned how his legend had taken on a life of its own. The story of the slave who had turned the master's bloodhounds against him had been passed from mouth to mouth, campfire to campfire, until it became more myth than memory. Some told of supernatural powers. Others swore the hounds had become guardian spirits of the enslaved. Embellished though it was, the tale carried hope like contraband, reminding the oppressed that even the tools of terror could be turned against their wielders. In Canada, Peter built a broad web of allies, escaped slaves, white abolitionists, sympathetic officials, and even a few former masters who had renounced the institution they once upheld. This coalition gave him reach and resources far beyond what he could have achieved alone. Among the most valuable was Dr. Alexander Ross, a Canadian physician whose professional standing allowed him to travel the American South without suspicion. Ross gathered intelligence, mapped escape routes, and returned with grim reports of conditions in Georgia. It was Ross who delivered the news that struck Peter hardest. Master Whitmore had died suddenly in 1853, leaving his estate broken and sold off to pay debts. In his place came a Charleston businessman named Richardson, whose vision of slavery was colder and more mercenary than even Ford's had been. To Richardson, enslaved people were nothing but ledgers of profit and loss. He multiplied overseers, tightened surveillance, and enforced discipline with a brutality that surpassed what Peter remembered. One report shattered Peter's calm resolve. Richardson intended to sell the wife and children of Moses. The boy once torn nearly to pieces by Ford's hounds, the friend whose suffering had planted the first seed of rebellion in Peter's heart. Moses had survived his wounds, married and raised a family despite his limp and haunted eyes. Now Richardson's gambling debts threatened to scatter them forever. For Peter there was no question. He would return to Georgia. Crossing back into the South after years of freedom was an act of extraordinary danger. But Peter had changed. The quiet smokehouse worker was gone. In his place stood a seasoned operator, hardened by years of planning escapes and leading from the shadows. Yet the return stirred Ghost's memories of Ford's scream in the night, the weight of the blood he had washed from his skin, the faces of those still trapped in the fields he had once walked. Reconnaissance confirmed Ross's reports. Richardson's plantation was a fortress compared to the world Peter had known. Patrols moved in shifts, overseers carried modern rifles, and new methods of surveillance made escape exponentially more dangerous. The challenge was unlike anything Peter had faced. But rather than discourage him, it sharpened his resolve. He would adapt, evolve, and strike in ways his enemies could not predict. The mission to save Moses' family would demand everything Peter had learned: misdirection, patience, coalition building, and above all, the belief that no system, however fortified, was invulnerable. What had begun years earlier with a quiet man whispering to dogs in the moonlight was now a fully realized campaign against an entire machinery of bondage. Peter had returned to the South not only as an escaped slave, but as a master strategist, ready to prove once again that even the most entrenched power could be undone by intelligence and courage. Peter understood that this mission would be unlike any he had ever attempted. The risks were greater, the stakes higher, and the obstacles far more complex. Yet as he looked at Moses, broken, hesitant, and trembling, he knew that the operation wasn't only about getting a family north. It was about proving that even the most wounded spirit could be lifted out of bondage, that slavery's chains were not only iron, but also psychological, and that those could be broken too. To succeed, Peter relied on the network he had patiently built in the weeks leading up to the attempt. Local free blacks funneled him information about patrol schedules and overseer movements. Sympathetic whites passed along supply shipments that could be quietly diverted. Even a handful of Richardson's own slaves, emboldened by whispers of Peter's legend, risked punishment to share secrets about the property's defenses. It was a web of quiet conspirators woven tightly enough that if one strand broke, the others could still hold. The timing was perfect. The night chosen for the rescue fell during a grand gathering of plantation owners in Milledgeville, a social and political event that drew Richardson and most of his overseers away. With the core of the security force distracted, the plantation was vulnerable for the first time in months. Peter's plan was a masterpiece of coordination. Marcus and one Canadian ally would create diversions along the southern fence line, luring the few remaining patrols into the woods. Another operator worked to prepare fresh horses and wagons at a rendezvous point. Peter, with two trusted locals, would move directly onto the plantation grounds to extract Moses' family. Infiltration went smoothly at first. Slipping into the slave quarters under cover of darkness and storm-muted winds, they found Sarah and the children, ready, their meager belongings tied in bundles. Moses, however, resisted. His limp was heavier than ever, and his mind bore scars deeper than his body. He shook his head at Peter's plan, whispering that escape only led to dogs' whips and death. His hopelessness was so absolute that Peter knew logic alone could not reach him. So Peter revealed himself not just as an anonymous rescuer, but as the man Moses once knew. He spoke of Ford's death, of the night the hounds turned on their master, of the countless lives now free, because of what had begun with Moses' suffering. At first Moses only stared, disbelieving, but then Peter's words began to cut through the fog of fear. The final push came from Sarah. She pressed Moses' hand and spoke with the clarity of a mother who had already made her decision, if not for us, then for our children. They deserve to live without fear. That simple truth struck the deepest chord. Moses' shoulders sagged, then straightened. He nodded slowly and agreed to follow. Getting the family out required more care than any solo escape Peter had planned. The children could not be expected to remain silent through long miles of night travel. So Peter incorporated pauses, prearranged waypoints, where allies waited with safe houses, food, and distractions to mask their passage. One team scattered hogs in the far pasture to draw off patrol hounds, while another set small brush fires on the edges of neighboring land to pull attention outward. With each obstacle passed, the fragile trust in Moses' eyes grew stronger. Step by step, the family moved from captivity into the open dark of possibility. The weight of silence was broken only by the muffled whimpers of children and the steady, reassuring voice of Peter guiding them onward, as he had guided so many others. The first stage of the journey was complete when they reached the waiting wagons before dawn. Horses pawed at the earth, anxious but ready. Peter lifted Moses' children into the cart himself, feeling their tiny hands clutch at his arms. For Moses, it was the moment of transformation. Not a grand speech, not a sudden epiphany, but the simple act of seeing his family safely beyond Richardson's reach. Peter knew the hardest miles still lay ahead, but the impossible part was done. A man who had once believed escape was hopeless was now on the road north with his wife and children. For Peter, that was victory enough, and the beginning of another story that would ripple through the South like fire on dry fields. Peter's planning for Moses' rescue showed just how much his methods had evolved since that first night he crept through Ford's kennels. He knew families could not move like single men. Children cried, elders faltered, and fear could unravel even the strongest resolve. So he devised specialized techniques, mild sedatives brewed from herbs, to soothe infants, modified routes that kept the group clear of settlements where silence was critical, and safe houses outfitted with hidden compartments big enough to conceal entire families if danger pressed too close. These innovations marked a new phase of resistance, large-scale extractions, rather than solitary escapes. The journey from Richardson's plantation proved more difficult than any Peter had faced in his early days. New roads cut across once hidden trails, settlements had sprung up in what had been open fields, and patrols were more frequent and better armed. Where once he relied on instinct and memory of the Georgia woods, now he had to adapt constantly, recalculating with every mile to stay ahead of potential pursuit. Their first stop was Ezra's farm in Virginia. Ezra, a free black farmer and longtime ally of the Underground Railroad, had spent years perfecting his property as a sanctuary. False walls, root cellars with air shafts, and even decoy storage barns that masked hidden compartments. Peter trusted Ezra like family, and that trust bought the rescue team a critical pause to rest, regroup, and plan the next stage north. But the physical escape was only part of the battle. Moses' mind remained fragile. The reality of defiance gnawed at him, triggering waves of panic that threatened to unravel the mission. Peter, recognizing the limits of his own role, assigned Marcus to support Moses directly. The younger man understood the language of trauma, having walked through his own fire of rage and despair. Their bond steadied Moses, giving him a peer's reassurance, where a leader's orders might have felt like another burden. Traveling with children and the wounded forced Peter to break from standard Underground Railroad protocols. They lingered longer at safe houses, waited for cover of storms, and sometimes moved by wagon or boat rather than on foot. Each deviation carried new risks. The most harrowing moment came on the Maryland border. A patrol of slave catchers cut off their intended route, and the group was forced to retreat into a swamp, hiding for nearly 24 hours. The stagnant air and damp cold took a toll. When Moses's youngest child spiked, a fever panic rippled through the group. One loud cry could bring hunters crashing through the reeds. It was here that Dr. Alexander Ross proved indispensable. Having joined the operation for its latter stages, Ross carried medicine and the practiced calm of a physician. By lamplight, muffled under blankets, he treated the child's fever, while the others held their breath in silence. The patrols eventually moved on, none the wiser, but the ordeal left everyone shaken. By the time they crossed safely into Pennsylvania, the group was bonded not only by their shared danger, but by the sense that they had achieved something extraordinary. Moses's family was alive, free, and together. For Peter, the rescue was proof that his methods could scale beyond individuals, that even families could be plucked from bondage despite the South's tightening grip. News of the operation spread quickly through abolitionist circles. Moses's escape became a rallying story, a living counter-argument to the fatalism many enslaved carried. Requests for Peter's help multiplied. Families facing separation, whole groups at risk of sale, began seeking the strategist, whose plans had bested Richardson's fortified plantation. This momentum propelled Peter into his most ambitious work, yet the planning of coordinated rescues across South Carolina. Dozens of operators spread across multiple states relied on his designs to synchronize efforts that had once been isolated. It was no longer simply about survival or even defiance. Under Peter's guidance, the Underground Railroad began to resemble a true resistance movement, testing the limits of what small secret networks could achieve against an empire of chains. The South Carolina operation marked a turning point in both scale and ambition. Where once Peter had guided individuals and families to freedom, now he was orchestrating a multi-plantation rescue that stretched across county lines and required dozens of operators to move in perfect concert. For the first time, the Underground Railroad was not merely reacting to slavery, it was striking at its very infrastructure. Bold, risky, and unprecedented, the operation succeeded, and in doing so, it became a blueprint for the larger coordinated resistance activities that would rise in the years just before the Civil War. For Peter, this success reshaped his view of resistance. He began to think less in terms of isolated acts of liberation and more about systemic change. The lessons he had first glimpsed in Ford's downfall, that oppression always contained its own contradictions, now informed his larger philosophy. He saw how to turn slavery's machinery inward, how to exploit its greed, its reliance on fear, its blind spots. This growing intellectual framework made him not just an organizer, but a strategist, whose ideas influenced younger conductors and resistance leaders across the borderlands between slave and free states. It was during this period of growth that Peter was approached by agents of John Brown. Brown's radical plan for armed insurrection in Virginia was already taking shape, and his supporters sought Peter's expertise. His unique blend of skills, animal handling, counter-surveillance, knowledge of plantation defenses, was precisely what Brown's men needed. Peter found himself at a crossroads. He had always favored careful, targeted operations. But Brown represented something more explosive, the possibility of striking a direct military blow at the heart of slavery. Ultimately, Peter lent his knowledge to Brown's circle. He shared intelligence on plantation security patterns, taught methods for neutralizing guard dogs, and advised on disrupting cavalry horses to slow reinforcements. His contributions helped refine the tactical edge of Brown's vision. But this choice also placed him under extraordinary risk. When the raid on Harper's Ferry collapsed in 1859, Peter's name surfaced in the widening net of suspicion. The months that followed were the most dangerous of his life. Federal marshals, Southern vigilantes, and informants worked feverishly to dismantle abolitionist networks. Peter, now marked by his connection to Brown, was forced to suspend much of his Underground Railroad work and go underground himself. For the first time since his escape from Georgia, survival, not operation, was his primary task. Yet even in this climate, he quietly consolidated his networks, laying low, while ensuring that when the storm passed, the roots and allies would still be intact. The election of Abraham Lincoln in 1860 shifted the balance again. Secession swept the South, war loomed, and the clandestine knowledge Peter had amassed over 2 decades suddenly had national value. His intimate familiarity with plantation operations, patrol patterns, and Southern geography made him invaluable to Union planners. The man who had once whispered to dogs in the moonlight now advised generals transitioning from resistance fighter to intelligence operative. Through it all, Peter never lost sight of the arc that had carried him from Ford's kennels to Union war councils. What began as one man's personal battle for survival had evolved into a campaign of strategy, philosophy, and eventually war. He embodied the truth that oppression's power was never absolute, and that courage, cunning, and community could bend history itself. By the time the Civil War engulfed the South, Peter Williams had become far more than a fugitive who once turned bloodhounds against their master. His intimate knowledge of plantation structures, patrol routines, rural geography, and the hidden language of enslaved communities made him a prized intelligence asset for the Union. Commanders leaned on his insights to predict Confederate troop movements, plan raids into agricultural strongholds, and anticipate how enslaved populations might respond when the blue uniforms appeared on the horizon. Peter was no longer fighting alone in the shadows. He was helping shape the strategy of an army. The war itself transformed the scale of his mission. Federal policies toward contraband slaves opened the door for mass liberations. No longer confined to guiding small family groups, Peter now found himself coordinating entire evacuations of plantations. His most daring wartime feat came along the Savannah River, where he orchestrated the liberation of over 200 men, women, and children in a single operation. It demanded a level of planning closer to military logistics than clandestine escape work, food wagons, medical supplies, and synchronization with advancing Union regiments. The success of the Savannah River Rescue electrified abolitionist circles and became a model replicated across the South, proving that freedom could be delivered at scale. Peter's Underground Railroad instincts, operational security, layered misdirection, and patient coalition building translated seamlessly into wartime resistance. He insisted that every operation begin with trust, earning the confidence of enslaved communities, aligning with local allies, and ensuring that no one was forced into escape without full commitment. These principles made mass liberations not only possible, but sustainable. By 1864, Union commanders acknowledged that his methods had become central to how they integrated liberated populations into the protective fold of the Army's advance. Yet, even amidst triumph, Peter never lost sight of the road ahead. He knew the war could destroy slavery, but it could not guarantee equality. Drawing on his years in Canada, he urged Union leaders and abolitionist partners to think beyond emancipation toward Reconstruction. Freed people would need schools, trades, and protection against the backlash that was certain to come. Winning the war was only the first step. Building a society where freedom meant more than words on paper would be the true test. That fall, as Sherman's armies marched through Georgia, Peter volunteered to return to the land where his journey had begun. Acting as a guide, he led Union troops through familiar terrain and finally back to the Whitmore plantation. More than a decade had passed since he'd vanished into the night, coated in pig's blood, and the return carried both triumph and sorrow. The fields were overgrown, the houses scarred by years of neglect and war. The plantation had passed through multiple hands, each owner more desperate and cruel as the Confederacy crumbled. Many of the people Peter had once known were gone dead from exhaustion and disease, or sold into the deep South. Among the survivors was Grace, the elder matriarch of the quarters. For years she had carried his story, the man who made the master's dogs turn the slave, who had broken fear itself and kept it alive like a flame in the dark. She told Peter that his legend had been more than memory. It had been a weapon sustaining courage when hope was scarce. Standing in the ruins of the Whitmore Fields, Peter finally understood the true reach of his defiance. It had not only freed him, it had given others the will to endure, resist, and believe that one day freedom would come. The liberation of Whitmore Plantation gave Peter a measure of closure, but it also laid bare the scale of work that still loomed. He had dismantled overseers, broken bloodhounds, and guided hundreds to freedom. But systemic oppression was not undone by any single act of bravery. The Civil War would end slavery in law, but rebuilding the South and the lives shattered by bondage would require generations. For Peter, this realization did not dampen his resolve. It gave him purpose. Peter Williams's life closed not as the story of a single man's escape, but as the seed of a movement whose ripples reshaped a nation. The Civil War's end brought the abolition of slavery, but Peter understood better than most that paper freedom without schools, land, and rights would leave the formerly enslaved vulnerable to new chains. So he turned his energies toward Reconstruction with the same discipline that had carried him through bondage, escape, and war. Drawing on the lessons he had learned in Canada, Peter built schools, churches, and community organizations across the South. He trained teachers, encouraged trades, and worked with allies, black and white, to carve out a foundation of genuine independence. Where once he had whispered commands to bloodhounds, now he spoke to assemblies of freedmen, urging them to embrace education, economic self-reliance, and solidarity as their strongest defenses. In doing so, Peter became a bridge between the secret networks of the Underground Railroad and the public institutions of Reconstruction, laying groundwork for movements that would echo into the civil rights struggles of the 20th century. The techniques he had pioneered, operational security, coalition building, exploiting the contradictions within systems of power, became part of the intellectual inheritance of later generations. Activists and organizers drew inspiration not just from what Peter accomplished, but from how he thought that no system was absolute, that even the strongest chains could be bent if one understood where they were weakest. The dogs that Peter had freed into the Georgia wilderness were never recaptured yet. Their legend grew. Hunters spoke of a ghostly pack, too clever to be trapped, too swift to be caught, and in time, their story intertwined with Peter's own. Among African American communities, the tale of the man who turned the master's hounds became folklore retold as proof that courage and cunning could transform fear itself into a weapon of freedom. In his final years in Canada, surrounded by children and grandchildren who would never know slavery, Peter often reflected on that night in 1850 when he walked into Ford's kennel with pig's blood slick on his skin and revolution in his heart. It was a single act of desperate defiance, yet it had ignited a chain of events that outlived him, fueling escapes, inspiring resistance, shaping Union strategy, and guiding Reconstruction. Peter Williams had shown that even the most powerless could find ways to fight back. That with courage, patience, and intelligence, an individual could challenge empires built on fear. The overseer's dogs had been turned under a midnight moon, and from their howl rose a legacy that carried forward into the long American struggle for freedom and justice.